The sand was never silent. Even before the gates opened, you could hear it. The low rumble of 50,000 voices, the clang of iron on stone, the shuffle of feet above and below the arena floor. Everyone remembers the fighters, the gladiators with their names carved into stone, their victories recorded, their deaths honored. Almost no one remembers the women who never stepped into the arena but were trapped around it. They moved through the shadows of Rome's greatest entertainment machine, unseen, unrecorded, essential. Blood sports were not just violence performed in sand. They were systems powered by invisible lives, and those lives were often female, often captive, and always controlled. The arena was an industry. When we picture the Colosseum or the amphitheater scattered across the Roman Empire, we see spectacle, wild animals, armed combat, theatrical executions. But spectacle required infrastructure. It required trainers who conditioned fighters for months. It required animal handlers who managed lions shipped from North Africa and bears brought down from Germania. It required entertainers, musicians, announcers, and an endless supply of enslaved labor to maintain the machinery of mass entertainment. And every conquest fed this system. Every military victory brought fresh captives, and those captives became commodities sorted not by their humanity, but by their utility to the state. After a campaign ended, after a city fell or a rebellion was crushed, the captives were divided. Some were sold into agricultural labor, others disappeared into mines where life expectation was measured in months. But women and girls, especially those considered young or attractive by the standards of their captors, often followed a different route. They were absorbed into urban systems, domestic slavery, textile production, food preparation, service in elite households. Their futures were determined not by choice, not by skill, but by market demand and the preferences of those who controlled the supply chains that powered Rome's entertainment economy. The gladiatorial games were not spontaneous. They were planned months in advance, funded by politicians seeking popularity, and advertised across entire provinces. Producing a single day of games required thousands of hours of hidden labor. Textile workers produced banners that hung from arena walls, stitched costumes for performers, and repaired the heavy canvas that shaded the crowd. Food vendors prepared meals for tens of thousands of spectators. Inside the ludi, the gladiator training schools, enslaved workers maintained dormitories, cooked for fighters, cleaned weapons, and managed the daily operations that kept these facilities running. Many of these workers were women taken during military campaigns, their labor extracted not through wages, but through absolute control.
Living near the training grounds meant hearing violence as background noise, the clash of practice weapons, the shouts of trainers, the cries of injured fighters. For enslaved women assigned to work in or near these facilities, brutality was not an exception, it was the environment. Some were tasked with washing blood-stained garments. Others prepared food for men who would be dead within weeks. The psychological weight of proximity to death, of serving systems designed to produce suffering for entertainment, does not appear in the historical record because no one asked these women what it felt like. Their inner lives were considered irrelevant. Sexual exploitation was embedded in this world. Enslaved women in urban entertainment districts, in the neighborhoods surrounding arenas, and within elite households lived under a power structure that treated their bodies as extensions of conquest. Roman law offered them no protection. Their captors were their owners in the most literal sense, and the legal system reinforced that status. The gladiatorial culture, which celebrated dominance, physical power, and violent hierarchy, normalized the exploitation of those with no legal standing to refuse. This was not an accidental feature of the system, it was structural. Captive women existed within a framework where their consent was legally meaningless, and their resistance could be met with lethal force. The legal code was explicit. Under Roman law, enslaved people were classified as res, things, not persons. They could be bought, sold, transferred, or destroyed at the owner's discretion. A master who sexually exploited an enslaved woman in his household was not committing a crime, he was exercising property rights. The legal framework did not recognize the concept of assault against someone who had no legal personhood. This was not a loophole in the law, this was the law functioning exactly as designed. The state reinforced ownership as absolute, and that absoluteness extended to every aspect of an enslaved person's existence, including their body. Women captured during military campaigns in Gaul, Britannia, Germania, Dacia, and across the eastern provinces were funneled into this system. After a city fell, after a rebellion was crushed, the captives were assessed. Age, appearance, and perceived usefulness determined their fate. Young women were considered more valuable in urban markets. They were transported to Rome, Pompeii, Capua, and other cities where the demand for domestic and entertainment-adjacent labor was highest. Once sold, they entered households where their daily reality was shaped entirely by the preferences and cruelty of whoever owned them. The entertainment districts near major amphitheaters, including the areas surrounding the Colosseum and the amphitheater at Capua, were zones of concentrated exploitation. Taverns, brothels, and lodging houses clustered near these sites, serving the crowds that came for the games. Enslaved women worked in these establishments under conditions of absolute control. They had no freedom of movement, no right to refuse clients, no legal recourse against violence. The proximity to the arena was not coincidental. The culture of spectacle, which celebrated physical domination and the public display of power, created an environment where exploitation was not just tolerated, but expected.
Inside elite households, the situation was no different, only more concealed. Wealthy Romans who sponsored the games maintained large estates staffed by dozens or even hundreds of enslaved workers. Women from conquered territories often filled roles that required proximity to the family: personal attendants, childcare providers, textile workers, cooks. This proximity meant vulnerability. A woman who served in the private quarters of a household, who had access to the family's intimate spaces, was also isolated and exposed. There were no witnesses to protect her, no legal authority she could appeal to, no social structure that recognized her right to say no. The household was a closed system, and within that system, the master's authority was absolute. Women were also used as political symbols. After a major military victory, a victorious general might hold a triumph, a grand procession through Rome where spoils, captives, and defeated leaders were displayed before the public. Pompey the Great held such a triumph after his campaigns in the East. Julius Caesar paraded captives from Gaul. Titus displayed prisoners from the siege of Jerusalem. Women from conquered territories were sometimes included in these processions, their presence intended to communicate the totality of Rome's dominance. They were dressed in the clothing of their homelands, marked as foreign, displayed as evidence of conquest. Public humiliation reinforced hierarchy. The crowd was not just entertained, it was being taught who held power and who had none. These displays were propaganda, and human beings were the medium. The triumph was theater, but its message was policy. By parading captive women through the streets of Rome, the state was demonstrating that entire populations had been subdued. The women were not individuals in these moments. They were symbols of defeated nations, physical proof of Rome's military supremacy. And after the procession ended, after the crowd dispersed and the political message had been delivered, these women disappeared into the same systems of exploitation that absorbed all captives. They were sold, distributed, absorbed. Their symbolic function ended, but their exploitation continued. The historical record is silent on most of this. The writers who documented the games, Seneca, Juvenal, Martial, focused on fighters, political scandal, and philosophical critique of spectacle. Seneca wrote about the moral degradation of watching men kill each other for entertainment, but he did not write about the enslaved women who cleaned the blood. Juvenal satirized the excess and corruption of Roman society, but he did not record the names of women sold in markets near the Forum. Martial composed epigrams celebrating famous gladiators and mocking social climbers, but he did not memorialize the captive women who served in the households of arena sponsors. Gladiators who won fame were sometimes memorialized in inscriptions. Their victories were recorded on stone, their names survived. But captive women were rarely named. They appear, if at all, as categories in ledgers, not as individuals in narratives. Their absence is not neutral, it is evidence of a deliberate structure of remembering and forgetting. History was written by those who had the tools to write it, and those writers did not find the lives of enslaved women worthy of record. So the silence itself becomes the archive.
What was not written tells us what was not valued.
The economics reveal the full system. Spectacle required supply chains. War produced captives. Captives became labor. Labor produced profit. Profit funded more war. And the cycle continued. When Trajan conquered Dacia, thousands of captives flooded Roman markets. When Septimius Severus campaigned in the east, the same pattern repeated. Each military victory fed the entertainment economy, and that economy depended on the constant availability of enslaved labor. Women's exploitation was not incidental to this cycle, it was embedded in it. They were not the central figures in the performance, but they were essential to its continuation. Without the labor they performed, without the food prepared for massive crowds, without the garments stitched for performers and fighters, without the households maintained for elite sponsors, without the sexual access granted to those in power, the games could not have operated at the scale they did. The Colosseum alone could hold 50,000 spectators. Feeding that crowd required industrial-scale food preparation. Maintaining the facility required constant cleaning, repair, and logistical coordination. Managing the gladiatorial schools like the Ludus Magnus near the arena required cooking, cleaning, and service labor. All of this work was performed largely by enslaved people, many of them women, most of them taken during military campaigns. They were the invisible foundation beneath the spectacle. The empire built its glory on spectacle, but spectacle was built on silence. The silence of those who could not write their own stories. The silence of those whose names were never recorded. The silence of those who survived, but were never asked what survival cost. And that silence, preserved across centuries, still shapes how we remember power. We see the monuments, we miss the hands that built them. We recall the entertainment, we forget the exploitation that made it possible. The women who lived in the shadow of the arena were not absent from history, they were erased from it. And that erasure was not an accident, it was policy, economics, and cultural memory working together to ensure that only certain lives would be remembered, only certain stories would be told, and only certain truths would survive the passage of time. The system did not end with Rome. The logic that treated human beings as fuel for spectacle, that sorted captives by market value, that erased the voices of the exploited while celebrating their exploiters, that logic has appeared again and again across history. Different empires, different arenas, different justifications, but the structure remains recognizable. Power builds monuments. Monuments require labor. Labor is extracted from those who cannot refuse, and history, written by the monument builders, forgets to mention the scaffolding. When we look at ancient blood sports now, we often focus on the fighters, their training, their courage, their deaths. We analyze the politics of the games, the architecture of the amphitheaters, the social function of spectacle. All of this is important, but it is incomplete. Behind every public execution, behind every gladiatorial contest, behind every imported animal and every cheering crowd, there was a network of control that extended far beyond the sand. Women were nodes in that network. They were captured in war, valued for their youth and appearance, distributed through markets, and put to work in roles that ranged from domestic service to sexual exploitation. Their labor was invisible because it was designed to be. Slaves were not supposed to be seen as individuals, they were supposed to be functions. The architecture of the Colosseum tells us about engineering, about Roman ambition, about crowd management and imperial propaganda. But it does not tell us about the women who prepared food in the kitchens beneath the seating tiers, who cleaned the corridors after 50,000 spectators departed, who served in the households of the senators and merchants who sponsored the games. These women moved through the same physical spaces as the celebrated fighters, but they moved through them as ghosts. Their presence was necessary but unremarked. They were infrastructure, not people. And that distinction was maintained through law, through custom, through the deliberate choice not to record their existence in any form that would survive.
Modern scholarship has reconstructed much about gladiatorial combat. We know about the different classes of fighters, the Murmillo with his fish-crested helmet, the Retiarius with his net and trident, the Thrax modeled after Thracian warriors. We know about training regimens, dietary practices, survival rates, and the social status of those who fought. But we know almost nothing about the women who washed their training clothes, who cooked their meals, who were present in the ludi but never mentioned in the accounts written by Suetonius or Cassius Dio. The historical record preserved what the powerful found interesting. Everything else was discarded. The historical sources do not describe their daily lives in detail. We do not have their letters, their testimony, their own accounts of what they endured. What we have are fragments, legal documents that mention ownership transfers, economic records that list prices, occasional references in literature that treat enslaved people as background detail. A papyrus from Egypt might list the sale of a young woman from Syria for a specified sum. A household inventory from Pompeii might note the number of enslaved workers without recording their names. A passing comment in Pliny the Elder or Columella might mention the management of domestic labor without acknowledging the humanity of those being managed. From these fragments, we can reconstruct systems but not individual experiences. We can see the structure but not the faces, and that is itself part of the story. The absence of their voices in the archive is not because they had nothing to say. It is because no one with the power to record their words believed those words were worth preserving.
This erasure was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate choices about what constituted history. The chroniclers of Rome documented military campaigns, political intrigue, imperial succession, architectural achievements, and the deeds of famous individuals. They did not document the interior lives of enslaved women because those lives were not considered historically significant. History was understood as the record of great men doing great things. Everyone else was scenery. And so the women who made the spectacles possible, who sustained the households of those great men, who endured exploitation as policy, simply vanished from the story. This is not a story with heroes and villains in the traditional sense. The system was the villain. The bureaucrats who processed captives, the merchants who sold them, the household managers who purchased them, the trainers who worked them, the guards who controlled them. Most of these individuals did not see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as participants in a normal, legal, socially accepted economic structure. The slave trader in the markets near the Forum Boarium in Rome was conducting legitimate business. The Lanista who managed a gladiatorial school in Capua was operating a regulated enterprise. The senator who purchased enslaved women to staff his villa on the Palatine Hill was engaging in standard household management. And that is what makes it so disturbing. The machinery of exploitation operated smoothly not because it was hidden, but because it was normalized. Everyone knew enslaved people worked in the households. Everyone knew captives from military campaigns were sold in markets. Everyone knew women in certain positions had no legal right to refuse sexual access. This was not a secret, it was public knowledge. Writers like Cato the Elder offered advice on managing enslaved agricultural workers. Varro wrote technical manuals on estate management that treated human beings as equipment. The poet Horace made casual references to enslaved servants in his work without moral commentary. This was the background reality of Roman life, visible to everyone, questioned by almost no one. And it continued because those with the power to change it had no reason to do so. The system was profitable, it was legally sanctioned, it was culturally accepted, and it served the interests of those who controlled Roman society. The games were popular. They reinforced social hierarchies. They provided employment for trainers, merchants, vendors, and administrators. They demonstrated imperial power to conquered populations. Disrupting the system would have required dismantling interlocking structures of law, economics, politics, and culture. No one with the authority to do so had the motivation, so the system persisted, and the women trapped within it remained trapped.
The psychological impact on the women who lived through this cannot be fully reconstructed. We do not have their mental health records, their therapy sessions, their private diaries. But we know enough about trauma, captivity, and sustained exploitation to understand that the damage was profound. Living under constant threat, serving those who celebrated violence, existing in a legal category that denied personhood, these conditions destroy the sense of safety that human beings need to function. Some women would have developed survival strategies, small acts of resistance, private spaces of meaning. Others would have been broken by it. Most would have experienced some combination of adaptation and damage, finding ways to endure while carrying wounds that would never fully heal.
The silence in the sources becomes more haunting when we consider what it represents. For every gladiator whose name was carved into stone, there were dozens of women whose names were never recorded at all. For every fighter whose victory was celebrated in an inscription, there were women who survived years of exploitation without anyone marking their endurance. For every public execution that shocked the crowd in the Colosseum or the amphitheater at Nimes or Arles, there were private violences that occurred in households across the empire, unrecorded and unremarked. The spectacle blinded history. We remember the blood that was meant to be seen. We forget the suffering that was meant to remain invisible. The arena was the visible center of a vast system. It was the showpiece, the spectacle, the part that Rome wanted the world to see. But the true operation of that system happened in the shadows, in the kitchens where enslaved women prepared food for fighters who would die for entertainment, in the textile workshops where they stitched costumes for performers in staged executions, in the elite bedrooms where they had no choice but to comply with the demands of those who owned them, in the training schools where they cleaned blood off floors and heard screams through walls. The arena could not have functioned without this invisible labor. The spectacle was only possible because thousands of people, most of them women, most of them captives, worked in conditions designed to extract maximum value while offering minimum recognition. When the games finally ended, when the Roman Empire collapsed and the great amphitheaters fell into ruin, the gladiators were remembered. Their fights became legends, their weapons were studied, their training methods were analyzed. Centuries after the last combat in the Colosseum, artists painted imagined scenes of gladiatorial contests. Writers like Edward Gibbon devoted pages to analyzing the social function of the games. Archaeologists excavated training grounds in Pompeii and Capua, carefully cataloging helmets, greaves, and swords. Museums displayed gladiatorial equipment with detailed explanations of fighting styles and class distinctions. The fighters were elevated from enslaved criminals and war captives to symbols of Roman martial culture. They became, in death and distance, respectable subjects of study. But the women who made the system possible disappeared from history a second time. First, they were erased from the record while they lived. Then, they were erased from memory after they died. The few references that survived were clinical, economic, administrative. They were listed as property in ledgers discovered in the ruins of Pompeii, counted as expenses in household accounts, mentioned as background detail in stories about more important people. A notation might record the purchase price of a woman from Germania sold in Rome in the year 112. Another might list domestic workers as line items in an estate inventory. But these were not stories, they were accounting. Their humanity was stripped from them twice, once by the system that enslaved them, and again by the historians who forgot them. The Renaissance glorified Rome. Artists depicted gladiators as noble warriors. Architects studied amphitheater design. Political philosophers debated Roman governance and military strategy. But no one painted the women who washed blood from training equipment. No one wrote treatises about the enslaved workers who maintained gladiatorial schools. No one composed poems honoring the captive women displayed in triumphal processions. The selective memory continued. The pattern of erasure was replicated by each generation that chose what parts of Roman history deserved attention.
Modern scholarship has begun to change this, but slowly. Archaeological evidence from sites like Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Ostia has provided fragments of information about daily life in Roman cities. Researchers studying skeletal remains can sometimes determine that certain individuals lived lives of hard labor. Economic historians analyzing trade records can reconstruct supply chains that depended on enslaved workers. But these are reconstructions built from absence. We can infer systems, we can estimate populations, we can analyze economic structures. What we cannot do is recover individual voices, personal experiences, or the interior lives of women who left no written record because they were never taught to write, never given materials, never considered worthy of documentation. We cannot bring them back. We cannot restore their names or recover their stories. The silence is permanent, but we can choose to remember that they existed. We can choose to acknowledge that the great achievements of empire, the monuments and spectacles and cultural productions that we study and admire, were built on a foundation of human suffering. The Colosseum stands as a marvel of engineering. It is also a monument to exploitation. These truths coexist. Acknowledging one does not erase the other. It makes the picture complete. We can choose to ask not just who was celebrated, but who was exploited. Not just what was built, but who built it. Not just what was remembered, but what was deliberately forgotten. These questions change how we understand history. They reveal that every monument has a foundation, every spectacle has infrastructure, every system of glory has a supply chain of suffering. The Roman triumphs parading captives through the streets were not just military victories. They were displays of human beings reduced to symbols. The games in the arena were not just entertainment, they were the visible peak of a system that consumed lives at every level.
The women who lived in the shadow of the arena are gone. Their bones are dust. Their names are lost. Their stories are irretrievable. But the pattern they were caught in, the pattern of using human beings as fuel for power, then erasing them from the story, that pattern is still recognizable, still operational, still waiting to be named. It appears in different forms across different centuries. The details change, the locations shift, the justifications evolve, but the fundamental structure remains. Exploitation made invisible, suffering made acceptable, erasure made policy. We see this pattern when we study history and find that only certain people were considered worthy of documentation. We see it when monuments celebrate conquest without mentioning cost. We see it when systems of power operate smoothly because those without power have been trained not to speak. The women behind the arena are not ancient history in the sense of being distant and irrelevant. They are ancient history in the sense of being the first documented example of something that has happened again and again, and will happen again, unless the pattern itself is named, recognized, and refused. The sand is silent now. The crowds are gone. The fighters are dust. And the women who never stepped into the light, who were never meant to be remembered, remain where they were placed by history, in the margins, in the gaps, in the silence between recorded facts. But silence is not the same as absence, and absence is not the same as irrelevance. They were there. They endured. They were essential. And the fact that no one thought to record their names does not mean they did not matter. It means the people who controlled the record did not want us to know how the system really worked. They wanted us to see the glory and miss the cost. They wanted us to remember the spectacle and forget the machinery. They wanted us to celebrate the empire and ignore the fuel that powered it. We do not have to oblige them. We can choose to look where they told us not to look, to remember what they tried to erase, and to ask the questions that were never supposed to be asked. What was the cost? Who paid it? And why were we never told?